Today's story is wrapped up in love, jealousy, and to this day, a big mystery still. But one thing we know for sure is that Samantha Wholford went from being a young mother, wife, and aspiring YouTuber to an overnight ruthless killer. I'm Brandi, and welcome back to Killer Bites, your favorite show bringing the hottest true crime stories in bite-sized pieces. Let's get into it. This story all started with calls of an alleged home invasion and kidnapping, which sent the police on a race against the clock to find a man before it was too late. But before we start our story from 2015, we have to go back a bit, about 6 years. Samantha was a single mother of 10-month-old twin girls at only 19 when she met 23-year-old Ernie Ibarra Jr., known to his friends as Dagon. They soon started dating and got married, eventually having 3 children together. They lived in the small town of Mount Pleasant, a part of Texas in Titus County. But they soon began to have problems, like all couples do, but their problems would take a serious turn for the worst. It started with a call to 911 when Samantha's aunt found her tied up, bound, and gagged in her home from what looked to be a home invasion. Although over the phone, Samantha seemed in distress, the dispatcher was hopeful that she could speak with Samantha directly and asked for the phone to be handed over. When she began to ask Samantha if she needed EMS, Samantha began a very long and detailed story about what happened to her during the invasion. Often when victims are in a traumatizing situation like this, they don't give this many details. But she was adamant on a few things, that the group that invaded her home hit her once in the face when they were trying to rile up her husband, and they asked her husband to tell them the truth or they'd kill her. During the call, she focused solely on what happened to her, never putting the focus of the conversation on her husband. When police and investigators arrived at the house, they began searching the house high and low for any clues as to where Dagon could be, with Samantha right by their side. The door had been kicked in, household items thrown and broken all over the floor. On the police body cam used as evidence in court, prosecutors saw that Samantha continually repeated her detailed story several times, mentioning how her husband was hit over and over and that the group of invaders knew how to move through the house to get to the second floor. Something investigators commented would be extremely hard to know unless they were familiar with the house because of the complicated stairwell. Something surprising about the footage is how Samantha never requested for a lawyer before speaking. But from her initial tears and willingness to help, it appeared that she was giving a full and honest account of what happened to her on this traumatic night. But don't forget, everyone, even if they don't read you your rights, any footage or statements collected on a body cam can be used as a valid form of evidence in court. Officers commented that the house did seem to be in a dire state, but not from a break-in. The overall cleanliness of the home was questionable, especially for the 5 children, ages 1 to 7, that were living under that roof. Samantha said she only caught one name of the attackers that night. His name was Luke, a name she wouldn't bring up again during the investigation. Every new detail Samantha gave officers was dramatized. She even changed her voice when mimicking her attackers, which psychologists say is what liars do to seem more believable. Officers discovered that they took Dagon's phone, but not Samantha's, something they found a bit odd but didn't pursue further. Samantha also said they cut her shirt off and made her stand in front of Dagon while they threatened him with ways they planned to abuse her. The shirt or sweater that she mentioned in her story was found by the kitchen table. As officers cased the house, making an account of the damage, Samantha was taking care of some business of her own. After a retrieval of her phone records, it was later discovered that at this time, she had sent out a text message saying, "Kill Day's phone, shut that down." Long locks of hair were found on the ground in the home. Samantha said that intruders had cut his hair off, but she didn't know why. Yet she remembered exactly what the intruders said when they cut it off. "You're gonna want something of your husband." Samantha then went into an elaborate story about how she had called for help by dialing on her phone with her nose, but her first point of contact wasn't the police, but her mother instead. The officers asked her to write down her statement at one point, which she was hesitant to, saying she didn't see how it would help them find her husband. But before she started writing, a radio call came in from responders saying they had a location pin for Dagon's phone a bit outside of Pittsburgh. They asked Samantha if she knew anyone there. They'd find out later that she did. One officer at the time tried to gather more information by speaking with Samantha's relatives who were waiting outside the house, her mother Rosie and Aunt Ginger. Rosie said that although Samantha had called her first, she called her sister Ginger to check on Samantha before she arrived because her house was about an hour or so away. Aunt Ginger said she was the one to discover Samantha bound and gagged in the house. Samantha kept dropping the name of a circle or group who she believed were a part of this crime. She'd continue to point a finger at them while she was at the station too. As the case at the house kept moving, so did Samantha's fingers as she sent another message from her phone, "Ditch phone, move." Another investigator soon arrived on the scene, but unlike other officers, he was immediately skeptical, citing that they had arrested Dagon several times before for assaulting Samantha and some of their children. On the body cam, he revealed that he had suspicions that Samantha may have staged the whole scene to make it look like something had happened to him. Officers didn't find a lot of blood in the home, which they found suspicious since Samantha claimed how the invaders were equipped with firearms and had beat her husband so much. It was at this point that they called Samantha upstairs to once again give them more details about the incident and what happened. She kept repeating the name of an acquaintance that she thought was involved, and then for the first time mentioned that the group that broke in was asking for $20,000 in compensation. Remember this, because it'll be important when Samantha begins to change her story very soon. When Samantha was alone with one of the officers, she started to become agitated and asked if they thought she was a suspect in the case. After that, she kept eyeing the officer's gun, asking him to tell her more about it and if he could show it to her. This seems like a strange request, right? But maybe not so strange for a person trying to figure out more details to add to their story. But Samantha said her reasoning behind this was to compare it to the one they had. The officer then asked what time they went to bed. She said 11. The next time they asked, she had a different answer to the question. At around 6, they brought her into the sheriff's office, a few hours after the attack, and this is where her story started to unravel. She first called her mom, but her behavior was a bit childish for being in the situation she was in. Samantha demanded a food order to be brought to her, and also began to lie on the ground, only getting up when the investigator finally entered the room, where her posture and tone of voice completely changed. But Samantha was used to putting on this kind of performance because she wasn't just an aspiring YouTuber, but also interested in becoming an actress someday. Samantha began by giving various convincing statements, saying that her intuition is always right, which is why she tried to direct the police over and over to investigate the circle she mentioned at her house. When asked if she took drugs, she said no and claimed she'd be willing to take a test right now. Unfortunately, the police had already been investigating her and her husband's circle of acquaintances and found out that this information was also false. When people usually tell the truth, they don't make a big fuss about a reason. They just straight up say yes or no. Liars, though, always look for a more convincing reason or statement to support their story. Samantha's story about the time her and Dagon went to bed changed, and she stated that she took an Ambien, which made it harder for her to wake up, but also makes you wake up fairly easily. Sounds confusing? Because it is. One after another, Samantha gave these kinds of inconsistent statements to investigators. She mentioned once again that her clothes had been cut from her body and she was presented naked in front of her husband as the invaders tormented them. But the sweater the police found had no obvious cuts. She said that her husband was forced to tell her that she couldn't call the police or that they'd come back and kill their children. Samantha said the scene was chaos as the intruders threw punches. But the children were all silently sleeping throughout all of this, quietly in their beds, just like how investigators found them. The officers asked her about the statement she made about money, and Samantha repeated that they wanted her husband to come up with $20,000 in the next 5 minutes. When asked about the weapons they had, Samantha gave some familiar statements for someone not familiar with guns. The investigator then turned the conversation in a direction Samantha didn't seem too pleased about. He asked if she had possibly fought or hurt her husband that night due to marital problems. She said no and became flustered when questioned if she had any idea or leads about who could have taken her husband. But like she had been doing all night, instead of keeping focus on her husband, she turned the conversation to herself, saying there's no way she could know because she doesn't go out, have friends, and doesn't have drama in her life. She even noted that her closest friend lived in Sulphur Springs, about a 45-minute drive by car from Mount Pleasant. This portrayal of being a hard-working, stay-at-home mom came under fire by the police report, as the house, after being documented, was found to be filled to the brim with used dirty diapers on the floor, trash thrown everywhere. Even Samantha's children appeared to have been unwashed for several days and wearing dirty clothes. The investigator also asked how Samantha felt watching her husband get beat up, because previously, when they had met during other marital abuse calls, she had told the officer that she wanted to stab and hurt her husband. She denied feeling anything but sad and commented that at some point in time, all people lose their temper. But Samantha claimed she had nothing to do with her husband's disappearance that night. The officers changed tactics and soon sent a sheriff in to question Samantha, and he pressed her hard for more information. He stated that none of the evidence found at the scene matched up with her story, and that they found her husband's blood in the family's pickup truck. The sheriff put on a good guy act at first, saying that he believed Samantha wasn't a part of all this, but he wanted her to explain how that blood could have gotten there, and did it have to do with any acquaintances she knew. But like always, Samantha had an answer for this too. She said the invaders wanted to check with 100% certainty that her husband was the man they were looking for, so they went to his truck, got his wallet, and checked his ID. But the sheriff kept Samantha straight, letting her know that the blood patterns of her story, again, didn't match with the evidence that was found. The drip blood pattern they found was evidence that her husband had been physically in the car and couldn't be just a swipe or smear of blood from the hands of the men that she said beat her husband in the face over 100 times. Drip patterns happen when there's a lot of blood pooling or dripping down onto the floor. The sheriff kept his neutral position, saying that her story and evidence somehow weren't matching, but that he believed she wasn't strong enough of doing this on her own, likely trying to fish out an accomplice list from her. But she claimed she had nothing like a secret boyfriend or anything like that. As the sheriff left, he asked her if she needed anything to drink, but all she wanted to know is where they'd taken her phone. He told Samantha they wouldn't be able to give that back for a while because they'd obtained a search warrant for it and were gonna have to search all calls and messages she'd had in the past year. And from the surveillance footage, it's clear this really shook Samantha up. She began to cry and beg the sheriff to believe her, but it only brought out more questions from him. He asked her how she was able to call for help on her phone after the attack. Samantha once again said she used her nose. He gawked at this and asked why the invaders took her husband's phone and not hers. She said she lied and told the abusive men that she didn't have one, but the sheriff continued to press her on how she accomplished such a feat. She said she wiggled across the room while she was bound and was able to get it out from under the bed where it had been stashed. She said calling her mother was the easiest thing to do because she was the first one on her call list, saying she was unable to call 911 with her face. This statement also came under fire pretty quickly when one of the witnesses that came to the house said Samantha's phone was sitting in her lap during the aftermath of the attack. The sheriff quickly turned his questioning after this to Samantha's personal life, asking for clarification on what appeared to be more than a love triangle in her life. He named several of the men she had been known to be talking with, and Samantha chuckled, saying that even though she was married, it was okay for her to have male friends. but the sheriff pressed again, saying that these men weren't those types of friends. They were something a bit more than that. But this got Samantha started on a story about her parents and how she wished she had married someone like her dad, someone more faithful who would never take their eyes off of her. Not exactly an ideal time to be bad-mouthing your husband when he's gone missing and is possibly in a life or death situation, if you ask me. But Samantha continued saying she wished she had married a perfect husband like her father, unlike Dagon, who she claimed cheated on her more than once. Wouldn't someone really worried about a loved one's disappearance be more fearful of all of this? Well, I guess from this little speech alone, it's clear that Samantha didn't have the purest of feelings when it came to her husband. But Samantha said she'd met up with various guys when she wanted to have fun, go out to bars and dance when she visited the area around her parents' house. A little different from the I only stay at home and have no friends story she was just telling the officers before. Samantha said things had been rough for the couple since last October, when she had filed criminal trespass charges on her husband and his sister, who were both harassing her. But she dropped them after he agreed to go to anger management classes and put in more work into their relationship. But this too is a different story than officers had previously heard, because Samantha claimed that Dagon wasn't the jealous type and didn't care what she did with other men as long as she didn't bring them home. Some things are just not adding up, right? Samantha then got closer to a man named David Smith, who, upon realizing that Samantha still planned to go back to her husband, absolutely freaked out and started getting angry, allegedly. The police decided to pursue this lead, asking her to give them David's address. But then they threw her a curveball that she wasn't expecting. They asked Samantha if she'd let them verify her statements by having her take a polygraph test. You know, a simple lie detector test. But she wasn't so gung-ho anymore about being checked for her honesty. It's at this point that the sheriff pulled out his bad cop act and started calling Samantha out. From the footage, it may seem like he overdid it by telling her he thought she'd be locked up soon, but this was probably an intended tactic to pull out a strong reaction from Samantha, whose roller coaster of emotions had been inconsistent since police arrived. And although they lied to her, saying that she could get locked up in jail just for lying, police are legally allowed to mislead suspects as long as they don't pressure them to confess. But the police took a step in the right direction, because Samantha's reaction was very telling when she brought up a friend named Charla. She said Charla and her boyfriend had listened to Samantha several times complain about her husband, but it was Charla's boyfriend that suggested Samantha let him take care of it. Samantha had no evidence that these two people were involved, but it made one thing very clear to the police. Their suspect list was growing, and they could now ask more people about Samantha's true character. She gave them the boyfriend's name and Facebook, John Rebel. This is where things began to snowball, as Samantha, who claimed she knew no one, began to drop names left and right. When officers asked who John Rebel could have called to help him, Samantha said she saw him once with a man named Tay, who police would later find out is Octavius Rhymes. Also, John Rebel's government name was found to be John Sanford. When the police began to leave the room in pursuit of making their first arrests, Samantha revealed through tears that she knew the third person that had invaded her family's home. She believes she met the man at the hospital the previous day, where she had run into John and Tay. She said they called him Jojo, but believed his real name to be Jose. She gave a detailed story about where he lived and what people knew about him, even though just moments before she said she had only just met the man yesterday. Jojo and Tay also happened to live just a bit outside of Pittsburgh. Sound familiar? That's right, the same location police had tracked Dagon's phone to at the house. The police then headed to the local hospital to visit Charla's room, which Samantha said had been a meetup spot for days for these three men. Then at around 10 a.m., both Jojo and John were apprehended and taken into custody. The police first brought in John for questioning, and after reading him his rights, the officer was upfront with him, stating that Samantha was pointing a big finger at JoJo, but they wanted to allow John to tell his side of the story, if he was willing to. John stated that he has never had the will to kill anyone. The only problem he has is males hitting females, and that's where he and Samantha began their relationship. John recalled how Samantha said several times that she wanted to hire someone to deal with her husband. Maybe not in the take him out and kill him sort of way, but someone to set him straight physically. John said she was talking to someone right now who specialized in that. John then began to recount the events that had taken place the night before. He said that he and JoJo started off by driving to Samantha's house, and there was a third member in the back seat that was related to Tay, but it was the first time he had ever met that person. When officers asked if he willingly did these things on his own accord, John seemed to imply that JoJo was the one running the show and the scheme, because John's life had been threatened. John was the only one who knew the layout of the family's home, so when JoJo asked where everyone slept, John directed him to the staircase leading to the second floor. Once JoJo and the mystery third man went upstairs, in his words, he said that they beat the living hell out of Dagon. But John surprisingly claimed that he believed Samantha wasn't at fault for this, defending her by saying that she may have exaggerated and spoken too much, but that couldn't be connected to JoJo's actions. In another room, an officer began questioning JoJo, pitting John's words against him by saying that he was putting all the blame for the previous night's incident on him and implicating that it was drug-related. But JoJo, now in a bright orange jumpsuit, said that when Samantha first talked about her husband to him in Tay's house one night, he clearly showed disinterest by saying he didn't have a clue who her husband was. Meanwhile, John in the other room brought up the fact that after JoJo beat Dagon, he asked him if he'd like to make the situation go away. He said JoJo pressured Samantha's husband to produce $20,000 in the next 5 minutes if he wanted things to stop, which is quite similar to what Samantha said at the house when police first arrived. John continued with the story, saying that after Dagon had been knocked out cold, JoJo told him to watch him while he went outside to prepare things. When they all went outside, Dagon included, they put Dagon's head on the hood of the car before they put him in the backseat of the truck and drove off. They drove all the way out to the countryside and took Dagon out of the car after taking him into a wooded part on the side of the road. John claims that JoJo told him to leave and go start the car. As John headed back to the truck, all he heard was a few pops before JoJo came back without Dagon. But in the next room, JoJo was telling a different story. He said that it was John who had actually pulled the trigger and that he was merely there. But all this only set the police in a frantic hurry because they still weren't sure where Dagon was, and from these new confessions, they knew they needed to find him quick. The police then drove with John in a police car to the wooded location from his story, and in the car, John was quite loose-lipped and willing to talk more in front of the new officers, all caught on an officer's body camera. John said that the mystery third person in the car the previous night is known around Pittsburgh as Cuz. The officers would discover his true identity soon, but John said that's all he knew of the man. Sadly, officers located Dagon's body in a shroud of trees at around noon on February 20th, 2015, and there were no signs that he'd be coming back to life. At around this time, Samantha had returned to her interrogation room after a smoke break and used the small whiteboard to write messages and draw while looking at the camera. It seemed she had not been informed that police had found her husband. A little after that, a group of officers and John headed to JoJo's home on suspicion that the gun and murder weapon had been stashed somewhere around the house. They encountered a woman sitting on the front porch named Lakona Slayton, who from body cam footage claimed she was JoJo's girlfriend, but not his wife. John told her that the officers knew everything and that they needed the murder weapon, but she claimed to not know where it was. Officers continued to pressure her, saying that her silence could be used against her and she could face the same guilty sentence that the others in this case will get. But one level-headed officer asked if they could walk around and explore the outside premises of the house. And after getting Lacona's permission, they found a tent pitched in the back that apparently serves as Lacona's home. Since they got her permission, they didn't need a warrant to search her tent. At this time, back at the sheriff's office, Samantha was once again writing on the whiteboard, but this time she looks directly into the camera after putting a question mark on her message, "Have you found my husband?" Officers at the house soon discovered a gun tucked underneath some bricks holding up the foundation of the home beside the tent, and they immediately went back to Lacona for more details. Her passionate cries that she didn't know anything about what was happening seemed believable, but she was aware that Jojo wasn't allowed to be in possession of a weapon based on the fact that he was a previously convicted felon. Lacona said she didn't have any other information that could help further the case along, only the fact that she wouldn't put it past Jojo to do something horrific like this, since he had also pulled the gun on her a few times in their relationship. 4 days after Dagon was killed, investigators sat down with Lacona again to see if they could get more details in unraveling what happened the night of this mysterious murder. But officers felt their work was cut out for them when Lacona reintroduced herself as Jojo's fiancé. What happened during those few days between the couple? We may never know. But one thing was for sure, this was a completely different angle than officers had last heard when she claimed that she was going to break it off with the man when they discovered the gun a few days before. But Lacona was shockingly honest about her confusion as to why Jojo would participate in this conspiracy when she knew Jojo was not acquainted with Samantha at all. She revealed that John and Tay knew Samantha very well, but Jojo had only met her the day before the murder. She also said that Jojo's true personality was that of a coward, and he'd shy away from doing some big confrontation like this. But from John's testimony, officers would learn that while on the way to Samantha's house that night, the three men smoked together in the car, which could be a reason as to why Jojo's naturally quiet behavior turned so violent that night. During questioning, Jojo was still adamant that John was the real murderer, claiming that the gun found under the house was because that was the hidden location John had put it, and it couldn't be in the tent. He also claimed that the gun actually belonged to John, but he had no clue where he had gotten it from. But during Lacona's questioning, she confirmed that the gun actually belonged to her and was a present from Jojo during their relationship. However, Jojo made it clear over everything that Samantha was the real ringleader of this all. He said he met her and her 5 kids at the hospital when visiting Charla, and then they all left and went to Walmart together a few days before the invasion. During their trip, they ran into Tay, who said he was in a pinch because he needed to return his mom's car home ASAP. So this is where everyone split up. Jojo claims he went home to Lacona, and Samantha and her family, John and Tay, all went somewhere together. That night, Jojo said that Tay, John, and Samantha, who brought her kids along again, showed up in front of him, but this time at his house. Jojo pulled him to the side and said Samantha wanted them to do something, but Jojo didn't get the full details of the situation until they began to drive to Samantha's house that night. He claims John only asked him to stand guard on the whole situation. But what Jojo didn't realize is he let a huge cat out of the bag. The unknown party Samantha and John were hesitant to give details on turns out to have been Tay, Octavius, the whole time. Officers quickly arrested Tay and brought him into custody after this, but not before Tay bargained with them to strike up a deal for his confession. The police said that they couldn't do a deal like that directly and that he would need to have a lawyer present to finish those details. But now, under questioning, Tay began to plead his case and fill holes in this murder story that officers had been wanting to fill. However, before they let Tay continue, police officers turned their attention back to Jojo, who seemed more interested in giving new details of what happened that night. Jojo said Samantha was downstairs with John during the night of the attack, and he had actually waited outside for them to come out. When John went to talk to Jojo, he said that Samantha had called her mother and she was on her way. It would take at least an hour before she got there, so they needed to get out of there with Dagon quickly. What no one could have anticipated, though, was that Samantha's mother had called her sister, who lived closer by, to check on Samantha before she could reach her daughter, something any worried mother would think of doing. JoJo said because of this, the three men left with Dagon and went out to the woods in a hurry, where John pulled the gun out and aimed it at Dagon. But JoJo stopped him, saying they were too close to the road and that it would be too loud, implying it might attract others to come by and check on them. Another slip of the tongue from JoJo that implicated him into being an accomplice to whatever happened that night. But JoJo wasn't the only one caught up in lies. More details revealed by Lacona, connected with cell phone tower records, proved that Samantha was definitely not at home sleeping around 11 p.m., like she said when police officers arrived at her home. The three men didn't drop her off at her home until around 10:30, according to Lacona, and a few hours later is when they'd come back and storm her house. Just 3 days after Dagon's murder, the police arrested Samantha on charges of aggravated kidnapping and murder. Eventually, the case came to a close as the four conspirators, John, Tay, JoJo, and Samantha, were all found guilty in a court of law and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. JoJo and John pled guilty the following year and were each given 50-year prison sentences in April 2016. Later that year, Tay went on trial and received 96 years for aggravated kidnapping and murder. Finally, Samantha, the ringleader and captain behind this sinking ship of a plan, went on trial in September of 2017. She received a 99-year sentence with an additional 50 years for the kidnapping of Dagon that should be served consecutively with her murder sentence. To this day, it's still unknown who pulled the trigger and killed Dagon on February 20th, 2015. And that's our story about Samantha and Dagon Ibarra. But what do you think of this story? Do you have any suspicions about who you think pulled the trigger? And what about the sentences given to the four members in this crew? Do you think they deserved it? Please let us know any and all of your thoughts in the comments down below. Once again, I'm Brandi, and thanks for watching Killer Bites.